For all the world's attention focused on Syria's refugees, they are sadly only the most recent peoples so afflicted. In 1992, it was Somalis who fled into the United Nations High Commission on Refugees camp in Dadaab, Kenya, now home to roughly 500,000 people. Ben Rawlence is the author of City of Thorns, 9 Lives in the World's Largest Refugee Camp, and he joins us now for more, and we're happy to welcome you all the way over from Wales to one of your colonies. Welcome to Canada. Let's start by reading an excerpt from your book, and then we'll show, actually, the place that we're talking about here. Sheldon, if you would. The town of Dadaab clings to the flat red plain a hair's breadth above the equator. Thorn trees stretch in a stubborn thicket for hundreds of miles in every direction. In the local dialect, the name Dadaab means the rocky hard place, because 2 inches below the red sand are sheets of diamond-hard stone. Those first inhabitants had no idea how appropriate the name would become. Let's also, if we can, bring a map up as well, and we'll show everybody in case they don't know. And I will confess, I'd heard next to nothing about this place until I saw your book. That's the part of the world that we're talking about. And if we go to visit there, as you did, Ben, what will we find?
Well, as you described in that passage, what you'll find is a flat red plain for hundreds of miles in every direction. And then in the middle, clustered around this small town of Dadaab, is 5 refugee camps. Each one is like some kind of giant suburb laid out in a grid fashion. But the houses in those grids are made of mud, sticks, plastic, and the fences between the houses are all made of thorns, which is where you get the name City of Thorns.
How many people were sent there originally 2+ decades ago?
Well, in the early 90s, when the Somali civil war happened and the government unraveled, there was a Black Hawk Down. As you may remember, the US and the UN tried to intervene and then pulled out. Around 90,000 people found their way across the border to this desert in northern Kenya, and they were settled in 3 camps. That population, of course, then reproduced. More waves of people affected by conflict came, and now we have 5 camps, and the official refugee population is around 350,000, but there are many others living in the camp too.
And who set up the camp in the first place?
It was the UN, because Kenya's a poor country. Kenya requested the UN to assist it in managing the refugee burden. So the UN was the one who originally managed everything, and they're still doing it now, 25 years later, on an emergency basis.
Presumably it was not meant to be a place for 500,000 people, though.
No, exactly.
So how, in heaven's name, are they managing?
Well, they're managing because the UN is supplying the camp with food. There are boreholes in the ground to bring up the water. But people aren't managing, really. I mean, they're just about clinging on somehow to make a life for themselves. This is like some sort of parallel planet, really, where life has taken on a shape of its own, because the Kenyan government doesn't allow permanent structures, no concrete, no bricks. So everything's made of tin and 2x4 and plastic.
Well, this is the funny thing. It was meant to be a temporary way station until they could find safer places to live.
Exactly. I mean, once upon a time, you would go to a refugee camp, you would expect to spend some years there, and either you go back to your home country when there's peace, or you find a new life in your new country, or you get resettled under this UN quota system. But part of the reason why Dadaab has grown and grown is because this UN quota system for sharing the burden is broken, and rich countries don't want to accept resettle refugees any longer, so everybody is stuck in the camp. Dadaab is one city, there are many of them. There are around 14 million now protracted refugees stuck in camps. So the million who've come to Europe recently, there's mostly Syrians, but not all by any means, is just a drop in the ocean, really.
So when we say these things are meant to be temporary places to live, nobody really thought 20 years was temporary.
No, and everybody is still denying, in fact, that they're permanent, because the Kenyan government doesn't want the camp there, so it doesn't allow any permanence. The UN, of course, is still treating it as an emergency situation. You have all the humanitarian emergency operators like Doctors Without Borders, Oxfam, Save the Children, they're all in the camp with the sort of temporary funding as well. But most interestingly of all, the refugees actually don't accept that it's permanent either, because they're all still dreaming that hopefully one day there's a future for them outside.
What ethnicities live in Dadaab?
Well, the majority are Somalis, about 95%, but there are also people from Ethiopia, from Sudan. So one of the interesting stories in the camp is a love story between a young woman called Muna, who's a Somali who was born in the camp, and a young man from Sudan who was a lost boy. There are, of course, some were resettled to North America, but there are many still there. And this young guy is called Monday, and he fell in love with Muna, and they have a baby. But that is anathema to the hardline family of Muna, who don't want their daughter to have a mixed faith baby. So a plot is hatched to kidnap the infant and to sacrifice it as some kind of honor killing. And then a whole drama ensues, which you can read about in the book. But the Lost Boys then have to defend the family with spears from the Somali mob who want to come and take the kid. So this shows you some of the tensions that are going on in the camp, even though it's a refuge for people seeking safety. So that family then have to go to a safe haven within the camp, and all sorts of other things ensue.
So one parent is Somali, one parent is Sudanese.
Christian.
And what is the nationality of the child?
So the child is stateless. It has a young girl called Christine, has a birth certificate, but it has a big red stamp on it that says refugee. So for a whole generation growing up in the camp, there are now, I think, 20,000, 30,000 who've been born in the camp who don't have any nationality at all. For them, the future is very bleak.
Now, this camp is in Kenya. How do the Kenyans feel about having this large group of refugees living within their borders?
There are very live tensions in Kenya around the refugee issue. The government has said several times that it wants to close the camp. Every time there's an Al-Shabaab terrorist attack in Kenya, the media is very quick to point the finger at Dadaab, at the refugees, even though there's no evidence linking the extremists with the refugee population.
Let's just be clear about that. The sense is that somehow the seeds of the terrorism come from these camps that we're talking about.
Yes.
But there is no evidence of a connection.
No, there's none. And there's been nobody's been able to prove that link at all. But there is this assumption that all Somalis are somehow terrorists. In fact, the refugees who are in the camp have fled from Al-Shabaab. And if they went back to Somalia, if you have a ration card with the UN number and so on, it's very likely that Al-Shabaab will apprehend you and may even execute you for taking the food of the infidels. That's what they say. So to be a refugee, in a way, you are very much caught between this rock and a hard place, because Al-Shabaab can exact revenge, and equally the Kenyans don't want you either.
How many millions of people living in refugee camps around the world right now?
There are 14 million in a protracted refugee situation, which means they've been displaced for more than 5 years.
So 14 million and 500,000 in this place.
500,000 in this particular place. Yeah.
How representative is Dadaab and environs to the circumstances that the remaining 13.5 million are living in?
Well, there are populations all over the place. For example, there are camps on the Thai-Burma border. There are a large number of people from Darfur in Chad. There are lots of camps in South Sudan, Central African Republic. There are also camps in Ethiopia, people from Somalia and so on. And certainly across the Horn of Africa, many of them do look like Dadaab. There is another refugee camp in Kenya, the second largest in the world, called Kakuma, which is 250,000 people, which was established at the same time. So this is a big reality, I think, which the world has to wake up to, which is that these places are becoming permanent, and we need to accept that, and we need to treat them as such.
We call them camps, but they're not really camps at all, are they? They're little cities.
No, they're cities, yeah. Although the residents would say it's an open prison, because they can't leave. There's a roadblock. You have to have a pass, like the South African apartheid system, to leave the camp, to go back down into Kenya. So people are very much confined.
How safe is it to live there?
There are problems because, of course, there are not enough police. It's spread over such a large area. You have these large grids where from one end to the other it's at least 30 miles. So some parts of the camp are quite remote, they're not well served, and there they have problems of sexual violence. And there's problems of domestic violence, because one of the things that you'll see, the stories in the book, there's two young people who are married, and they're trying to figure out their life, and they're having a baby, and there's such pressure on them to find enough food, to get money in the black market in the camp, then those pressures then play themselves out within the marriage.
I'm curious as to what you think about the current situation the world finds itself in, insofar as there has been quite an outpouring in a handful of countries to help the refugees from Syria. And Germany, Sweden in particular, have responded quite magnificently. Canada to a lesser extent, but still certainly significantly more than the United Kingdom or the United States for that matter. What do you think the residents of Dadaab think about this overwhelming opening to Syrian refugees?
Yes.
But of course, nothing for them.
Well, they follow the international news very closely, of course. They watch cable news, they listen to World Service and so on. And there's a certain amount of empathy for the Syrians who've gone through the same thing as them, but they certainly feel a little bit shortchanged and forgotten that the world is not paying the same attention to them. And it has actual material consequences because the UN has cut rations in the Dadaab camp and in many other camps because of a funding crisis, because they don't have enough resources to deal with all of the Syrians as well. So people are going hungry in the camp, in fact, because of Syria.
Do you have an explanation as to why the world seems to, or some of the world anyway, seems to have been so generous to the Syrian refugees and yet continues to turn a blind eye to the largest group of refugees in one place in the world?
Yeah. I think that the focus on Syria is a large function of the fact that they are the largest number who have come across the Mediterranean into Europe now. They are also, to be fair, the largest population of displaced people. The UN recently confirmed it's registered 4.5 million Syrian refugees. Somalis are a bit lower down the table. There's 1 million refugees registered. So although it's a bigger population, it's more visible because they're the ones coming onto the shores of Europe. But what we need to remember is that is symptoms of this bigger crisis, that this has been a slow burn for many decades. For 10 years, 10 years ago, I was following this for Human Rights Watch, where large numbers of people were coming across the Mediterranean into Italy and so on. And those numbers have not been going down. They've been gradually slowly building. So this is nothing new. It's just that we're lately waking up to it.
I'm not alleging anything here, I'm just asking. But many of the people that you chronicle in your book are black. And the Syrian refugees are not. And I wonder whether you think that's part of the story here.
I think that's probably got something to do with it. I think the Syrian population is also mixed, so there are Christians as well as Muslims, and I think that complicates the picture. But I think, as we've seen with the reaction to the attacks in Cologne in Germany, that racism is very close to the surface, and actually it doesn't take very much to activate it. Do
the people in Dadaab think that the Syrians, while they may sympathize with them, are in some respects queue jumpers? Because after all, people in Dadaab, some of them anyway, have been waiting 20 years for what's happening to the Syrian refugees.
There's certainly an element of that. I mean, the story I mentioned of Muna and Monday, who they were supposed to be resettled quite quickly because they were at risk. Their baby was being hunted in the camp. So they were put on this fast track for resettlement, but it was going very, very slowly. And what they said to me, the way they understood it was, now is the time of Syria and our turn will come later. So they were very understanding, they were very patient. They've had to be patient. They've had to wait all this time. So part of what it means to live in Dadaab is to actually have this kind of oppressed attitude and to feel quite beaten down and to have very limited expectations.
How do we make sure that the temporary refugee camps that have been set up for the Syrian refugees don't become Dadaab 20 years down the road?
Well, I think what we're seeing, the Syrians are actually quite smart. They're looking at Dadaab and they're realizing that the camps that are on offer for them are not a temporary solution, that actually these are places where they're being asked to go and fester, and they're choosing not to. So Zaatari is one camp that's working quite well, but there are several other camps in Jordan which are empty. And the Syrians are deciding to take the illegal route to Europe because the legal one doesn't work. So at the end of the book, this book, for example, there's a young man called Guled who is considering making the journey from Dadaab to Europe, because the legal route doesn't work. There are only around 1,000 to 2,000 people taken from the camp every year to be resettled in North America or Europe. The birth rate is 1,000 a month. So for him, he's looking at those numbers and he's saying, this doesn't add up. I'm going to go to Europe, and he needs to raise $10,000 to make that illegal trip overland through the Sahara up to Libya, across into Italy. And there are several friends of his that have done it. So he knows he can do it if he can get the cash.
Ben, let me ask you one last question, and that is, in that chair not too long ago was Canada's Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. And I asked him this question, and I'd like your take on it. Rich Western nations, regardless of how wealthy they are, have a finite amount of money to spend on this kind of thing. I think the minister said Canada's going to spend $700 million to try to resettle the Syrian refugees. Do you get a better bang for your buck using that money to get people out of those danger zones and into the quote-unquote new world? Or is it better to spend that money trying to make the homes they came from, their original countries, safer places to live so that they can stay where they've always lived their lives?
Well, I think the international system has to cope with all of those situations. Waging, in some cases, making those places safe means military intervention, which is very expensive and highly contentious and so on, and I wouldn't advocate that in every circumstance. I think there's 2 points worth mentioning. One is that maintaining refugee camps like this is very expensive and is kind of dumb, because the refugees want to work. They want to be self-sufficient. There's no point denying them the right to work and keeping them in this place and we having to pay to feed them. The other aspect is that all of the economic research that's been done shows that refugees are a net benefit to any economy. So it's kind of crazy to me to think that I don't really understand why European countries aren't all begging to have refugees, as Germany is, because it knows that actually if we resettle these people in areas of our country which are depopulated, they're going to be a net benefit to our economy. So this whole debate is driven much more by fear rather than actually an objective look at the reality. Understood.
Ben, it's good of you to come in tonight and share your story with us. City of Thorns, 9 lives in the world's largest refugee camp. Ben Rawlence, thanks so much for visiting us at TVO tonight.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.